Y'all know what's going on. It's time for another episode of Doing Time with Joe. I'm your host, Joe Bacon. Welcome to the show, y'all. Some wars start with a cannon shot. Others start with the slap of a domino on a folding card table. A sound that can be just as final, just as deadly. This is a story about a war like that. A war that started in the back room of a barbershop on a hot July night over a game that was supposed to be about brotherhood, but that ended in a river of bad blood. The game was a weekly ritual, a sacred thing for the old heads on the block. It was a place where the ghosts of their old lives could come out and play, where a man was judged not by the size of his rap sheet, but by the sharpness of his mind and the strength of his trash talk. At the center of that game was a man named Pops. He was in his 60s, a man who had seen it all, done it all, and had by some miracle survived it all. He was the unofficial mayor of the block, a man of a quiet and absolute respect. And his partner, his right-hand man at the domino table, was a dude named Smooth. Smooth was younger, in his 40s, a charismatic and fast-talking hustler who had a smile that could talk a dog off a meat wagon. He was the life of the game, the one who kept the jokes flying, the liquor pouring. He was a good man in his own and complicated way. But that night, there was a new player at the table, a young buck named K-Dog. He was in his early 20s, a product of the new streets, a kid with a hungry look in his eyes and a chip on his shoulder that was bigger than the whole damn city. He wasn't there for the brotherhood. He was there for the money and the respect, and he wasn't getting either. He was losing. Badly. The dominoes weren't falling his way. And with every bone he threw, with every dollar he lost, the easy bravado he had walked in with was being chipped away, revealing the raw and insecure and angry kid underneath. Smooth, in his good-natured way, was riding him hard. "You gotta have the heart for this game, young blood," he'd say with a laugh as he slapped down another winning tile. "And right now, your heart is looking a little weak." The other old heads laughed. But Pops, he saw the look in K-Dog's eyes, the look of a cornered animal, the quiet and dangerous shift from a simple frustration to a deep and personal humiliation. The air in the small, smoky room was starting to get thick. The friendly game of dominoes was starting to feel like something else, a power play, a test of a manhood. And in a world where a man's pride is the only currency he has, that is the most dangerous game of all. The dominoes were no longer just pieces of plastic. They were becoming tombstones. And the night was about to deliver its first and most tragic body. The night wore on, and the hole K-Dog was in just got deeper. The pile of his cash in the middle of the table had dwindled to a few in lonely, crumpled bills. And with every loss, Smooth's trash talk got a little sharper, a little more personal. He wasn't being malicious. It was just the way of the game. You get a man on the ropes, you don't let him up. But he didn't see the storm that was brewing behind K-Dog's eyes. He didn't see that he wasn't just taking the boy's money. He was taking his pride. And that was a debt that was going to be paid back in a currency that was far more valuable than cash. Pops tried to cool it down. "All right, Smooth, leave the boy alone," he said, his voice a low and quiet rumble. "He's just having a bad night." But Smooth was on a roll, high on the liquor and the victory. "A bad night?" He laughed. "Pops, this ain't a bad night. This is a bad career. The boy ain't got the stomach for this." And then he said the words that would seal his own and final fate. He looked at K-Dog, a pitying and dismissive smile on his face. "Maybe you should just go home to your mama, little man," he said. "This is a grown man's game." The room went silent. The slap of the dominoes stopped. The only sound was the buzz of the old and tired air conditioner in the corner. "Little man." It was a simple phrase. But in the brutal and unforgiving language of the streets, it was a castration, a public execution of a man's pride. K-Dog's face went blank. The anger, the frustration, it all just disappeared. And in its place was a cold and quiet and terrifying emptiness. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping on the linoleum floor. "What did you call me?" he asked, his voice a low and dangerous whisper. Smooth finally saw it. The storm. He had pushed too far. He tried to backtrack, to laugh it off. "Hey man, I was just playing." But it was too late. K-Dog was no longer a boy losing a game. He was a man who had just had his honor stripped from him in front of his peers. And in his world, there was only one way to get it back. He reached into the waistband of his jeans and he pulled out a gun. The room went from a dead silence to a frantic and chaotic explosion of emotion. Men were diving under the table, scrambling for the door. The game was over. And a new one, a more deadly one, had just begun. The gun in K-Dog's hand was a cheap and ugly Saturday night special. But in that small and crowded room, it had the power of a cannon. It changed the entire and gravitational pull of the universe. Suddenly, the young and losing boy was the most powerful man in the room. Pops was the only one who didn't move. He just sat at the table, his old and weary eyes fixed on K-Dog. He had seen this scene 100 times before. A young man with more pride than sense, holding a piece of steel that was about to change his life forever. "Put the gun down, son," Pop said, his voice a calm and steady anchor in the storm of a panic. "This ain't worth it." But K-Dog wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on Smooth, who was standing by the table, his hands raised in a gesture of a slow and careful surrender. "What's the matter, Smooth?" K-Dog said, his voice a high and reedy and unfamiliar thing. "You ain't talking so much now. Who's the little man now?" He wasn't a killer. He was a kid playing a part. He was acting out a scene he had seen in 1,000 movies. He didn't want to kill him. He just wanted to win. He wanted to take back the respect he had lost. But a gun has a logic of its own, and it has a way of turning a performance into a reality. Smooth, to his credit, was trying to de-escalate. "You're right, Kay," he said, his own voice a low and soothing purr. "I was out of line. I'm sorry. The money's yours. Just take it. We're good." He started to push the pile of cash in the middle of the table toward K-Dog. And that was the mistake. The movement. It was a small thing, a gesture of a piece. But in K-Dog's paranoid and adrenaline-soaked mind, it was a threat. He flinched, and his finger, trembling on the trigger, tightened. The shot was a deafening crack in the small and smoky room. It was a wild shot, a panic shot. It wasn't aim. But in a room that small, you don't have to aim. The bullet hit Smooth in the chest. He stumbled back, a look of a profound and final surprise on his face. He looked down at the small and dark and blossoming flower of a red on his shirt. He looked back up at K-Dog. And then he just fell. A marionette with its strings cut. The room went silent again. A different kind of a silence this time. A heavy and suffocating and permanent silence. The silence of a death. K-Dog stood there, the gun smoking in his hand, his face a mask of a pure and absolute and soul-shattering horror. He had done it. He had won the argument. He had gotten his respect, and he had just ended his own life. He looked at Pops, his eyes a silent and desperate plea for an answer that did not exist. And then he just ran. He ran out the back door, a ghost, disappearing into the long and dark and unforgiving night. The back room of the barbershop was a tomb. The men who had scattered at the first sign of a trouble were gone. It was just Pops and the body of his friend Smooth and the quiet and accusing ghosts of 1,000 bad choices. Pops was an old man, a man who had seen his share of a death. But this was different. This was a senseless death, a stupid death, a death over nothing. And it had happened in his place, at his game. He felt a weight of a responsibility that was as heavy as a gravestone. He didn't call the police, not yet. He just sat there in the quiet and smoky room, and he mourned his friend. He thought about the laughter, the stories, the decades of a shared and brutal and beautiful history, and he wept, quiet and silent and bitter, tears for a life that had been thrown away for a handful of a pride. He knew what he was supposed to do. The code of the streets was clear. You don't talk to the police. You handle your own business. But what was the business here? K-Dog was a kid, a stupid and scared kid. And he was already a dead man walking. The streets would find him, and they would deliver their own and brutal form of a justice. But then he thought of Smooth's family, his wife, his kids. They deserved something more than the quiet and anonymous and brutal justice of the streets. They deserved an answer. They deserved a peace. He was a man caught between two worlds, the old world of the code and a new world of a conscience he thought he had buried long ago. He sat in that room for an hour, a king in a kingdom of a grief, wrestling with a choice that had no right answer. In the end, he made a choice. He picked up the phone. He didn't call the police. He called an old friend, a retired detective, a man he had known for 40 years, a man who had been on the other side of the game, but who had always been a man of a certain and quiet and grudging honor. "I got a body, Jimmy," he said, his voice a low and weary rumble. "A good man. And I got a name." He gave him the name. K-Dog. "The kid is scared," he said. "He's gonna run, or he's gonna die. You need to find him, and you need to do it right." For Smooth, he hung up the phone. He had broken the code. He had talked to the law. He had just committed the one and only sin that could not be forgiven in his world. He had become a snitch. But as he sat there, waiting for the sirens, he didn't feel a shame. He didn't feel a fear. He just felt a quiet and profound and deeply and tragically human sense of a peace. He had done the right thing for his friend and for the boy who had killed him. He had just chosen a different kind of a justice that was not about a revenge, but about a mercy for them all. The police found K-Dog a day later, holed up in his girlfriend's apartment, a scared and cornered animal. He didn't fight, he didn't run, he just gave up. The weight of what he had done was too heavy. And the cage, in a strange and tragic way, was a kind of a relief. Pops was brought in for questioning, a formality. He told his story, the sanitized version, a game, an argument, a shot. He didn't mention the gun. He didn't mention the names of the other players. He was a witness, not an informant. A fine and dangerous line to walk, but he walked it with the quiet and steady grace of an old master. He had given them the killer. The rest of the story was his to keep. The trial of K-Dog was a quiet and somber affair. He pled guilty. He stood before the judge, a boy in a man's clothes, and he wept. He told the story of his own and stupid and fragile pride. He told the story of a night that had been a game and that had ended in a grave. The judge, a man who had seen it all, saw not a monster but a child of the streets, of a violence, of a world that had failed him. But the law is a cold and unemotional thing. A man was dead, and a price had to be paid. He sentenced K-Dog to 30 years, a lifetime, for a moment of a madness. Pops was there in the back of the courtroom. He watched as they led the boy away, and he felt no sense of a victory, just a profound and weary and heartbreaking sadness. 2 lives shattered, one in a grave, one in a cage. And for what? For a handful of a pride, for the empty and tragic and ultimately meaningless rules of a game that has no winners. He went back to his barbershop, to the quiet and empty back room. He packed away the dominoes, the folding table. The game was over, for good. He was an old man now, a man at the end of his own and long and complicated road. He had lived his life by a code, and in the end he had been forced to break it. He had chosen a different kind of a loyalty to his friend, a loyalty to a justice that was bigger than the streets, a loyalty to his own and quiet and hard-won conscience. He was a man who had lived his life in the gray. And in his final act, he had chosen a side, the side of the right. And in that, he had found his own and quiet and final kind of a peace. And so we come to the end of the first act of this tragedy, a story of a game that had become a war, and of a war that had left no winners, just casualties. Smooth was in a grave, K-Dog was in a cage, and Pops was in a prison of his own, a prison of a memory, of a grief, of a profound and unending sense of a loss. The barbershop was no longer a place of a laughter, of a brotherhood. It was a tomb, a quiet and dusty and haunted place. Pops would sit in the back room and he would just remember. He would remember the sound of the dominoes, the smell of the whiskey, the sound of his friends' laughter, and he would be consumed by a quiet and profound and all-consuming sadness. In this story, the story of the domino game that turned deadly, it's a story about the brutal and senseless nature of a street pride, a pride that is a mask for a deep and profound insecurity, a pride that will lead a man to kill, to die, for nothing more than a few words, a look, a gesture. It's a story about a world where a boy's life is worth less than $70, and where a man's honor is a thing that can be lost and reclaimed at the end of a gun. And it's a story about a quiet and courageous act of a betrayal. Pops had broken the one and only code he had ever lived by. He had talked to the police. He had become a snitch. But in doing so, he had chosen a different and more difficult and ultimately more honorable path. The path of a justice that was bigger than the streets. The path of a peace that was more valuable than a pride. The path of a good and decent and heartbroken man. He was a king who had lost his kingdom. But in the ruins, he had found something else. Something that was in the end far more valuable. His own and quiet and hard-won soul. This has been another episode of Doing Time with Joe. I'm your host, Joe Baker, and I say peace, y'all.